Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. If you've got an exam on neural networks coming up, you are in exactly the right place. We're going to break down everything you need to know, from the core theory all the way to a hands-on lab. Okay, so here's our game plan for today. We'll kick things off with why neural networks even exist, then we'll dive into how they work, and then we'll actually code one up. And of course, we'll wrap it all up with a final cheat sheet for your exam. All right, first things first, why do we even need neural networks? What's the problem they were actually designed to solve? Well, think about it. A lot of traditional machine learning models, things like linear and logistic regression, are really powerful, but they fundamentally work by trying to draw a straight line or a flat plane to separate data. And that's great if the data is simple. But what happens when the patterns are messy and curved? A single straight line just isn't going to cut it, right? And that's really the crucial point. When you have these complex curved patterns in your data, linear models basically just fail. They can't handle it. And this is exactly where neural networks excel. They are built from the ground up to model these highly complex, nonlinear relationships. I mean, think about trying to identify a cat in a photo. That's not a problem you can solve with a simple line drawn through the pixels. A neural network learns to see the important features, first edges, then shapes, and then eventually whole objects, like the cat's ears or its tail. It's learning on a completely different level, something a simple model just can't do. So how in the world do they pull this off? Well, it all starts with the fundamental building block of the whole system, something inspired by our own brains, the neuron. Let's take a closer look. A single neuron actually does three pretty simple things. First, it takes in a bunch of inputs and multiplies each one by a weight to decide how important that input is. Then it adds a little nudge, called a bias. And finally, and this is the most critical part, it passes that result through something called an activation function. Now, this activation function, it's kind of a secret sauce. This is what introduces nonlinearity into the system. Seriously, without it, the entire network, no matter how many layers you stack up, would just be a fancy, glorified linear model. The activation function is what gives the network the power to learn all those complex, curved patterns we were just talking about. Let's make this really concrete with an example. Okay, will a student pass? The neuron takes the inputs, calculates that weighted sum, adds the bias, and then applies what's called a sigmoid activation. And boom, it spits out a probability, about 0.62. So the model is saying there's a 62% chance the student will pass. We can then compare this to the real answer to calculate the loss, which is just a fancy way of saying how wrong the model was. Okay, so we've got one neuron down. Now let's start stacking them together to build a full network. This structure is called a multi-layer perceptron, or MLP for short. An MLP is basically just layers of these neurons. You've got an input layer where the data comes in, one or more hidden layers in the middle, and then a final output layer that gives you the answer. The really cool part is that as data flows through, each layer learns to recognize more and more abstract features. All right, let's walk through what's called a forward pass. We're going to see exactly how the network makes a prediction, step by step, for a student who studied for 5 hours and slept for 5 hours. First up, the hidden layer. Our inputs, 5 and 5, go to each of the 3 neurons. Each neuron does its own math, calculates its weighted sum, and then applies that ReLU activation function. So you can see the results here, 3.3, 4.5, and 7.2. These are the outputs from our hidden layer, and there will get passed on to the next stage. Okay, so now those 3 numbers from the hidden layer become the inputs for our final output neuron. It does the same thing again, calculates a weighted sum, and then applies the sigmoid function to squash the result into a probability. And what do we get? About 0.996. That means the model is predicting a 99.6% probability of passing. That's a fantastic prediction, which means our loss is going to be super low. And, MLPs aren't just for classification problems like pass or fail. They can also do regression, things like predicting a house price. The process is pretty much the same. You just swap out the activation function in the last layer for a linear one, so it can output any continuous number. Now, of course, with random starting weights, our initial guess here is way off, but that's what the training process is for. Okay, enough theory. Let's get our hands dirty and actually build one of these things. We're going to code up a neural network to solve a classic nonlinear problem. So we'll be using this dataset called Make-Moons. As you can probably guess from the picture, the 2 classes are shaped like interlocking moons.
There is no way you could draw a single straight line to separate them, which makes it the perfect challenge for our neural network.
And we're going to follow the standard machine learning workflow here. We'll generate the data, check it out, visualize it, split it, scale it, and then finally build, train, and evaluate our MLP model. It's a classic 10-step process. Now, this one line of code is really the heart of our entire lab. This is where we define the architecture of our neural network. We're setting up an MLP classifier with 2 hidden layers, the first with 50 neurons, the second with 30. We're telling it to use that ReLU activation and setting a few other parameters for the training process. So, we've built the model, we've trained it. Now for the moment of truth. Did our network actually learn anything? Let's check out its performance.
Wow, 98.8%. That is our accuracy on the test data, the data that the model has never ever seen before. That is an absolutely fantastic result.
And we can dig a little deeper here. The confusion matrix on the left shows us that the model only made 3 incorrect predictions out of 250 samples. That's amazing. And even better, look at the binary cross-entropy loss on the right. It's extremely low. This tells us that not only was the model getting the right answers, it was also very confident about them, which is exactly what you want to see. All right, let's pull all of this together into a final cheat sheet. If you're studying for an exam, this is definitely the slide you'll want to take a screenshot of. Okay, so for the exam, here's what you absolutely got to know. A neuron computes a weighted sum, adds a bias, and applies an activation. Those activation functions, like ReLU and sigmoid, are what add the nonlinearity to learn complex stuff. An MLP is just a network of these neurons in layers. The whole process of getting a prediction is called forward propagation, and we measure the error with a loss function. And remember the difference: sigmoid for classification, linear for regression. And in the lab, don't forget to scale your data first. So that brings us to the end of this explainer. We've seen how a network can take inputs and spit out a prediction. But that leaves us with a huge question. How does it actually learn from its mistakes? How does it know how to adjust all those weights and biases to get better? Well, that process is called backpropagation, and it's the key to making these networks truly intelligent.